Welcome to the Man Amongst Men podcast. Live a life of intentionality, adventure, and brotherhood. Take the inner journey and live out over your edge constantly. Here are your hosts, Dominic and Bryan.
If you've been listening to our podcast for any period of time, you are probably quite used to Bryan and I cracking open and spilling our guts all over the interwebs around some really personal stuff, particularly our sex lives. And one of the amazing things that we have an opportunity to witness are the emails and the private messages that we get in response from many of our listeners who have never noticed that they have a problem with their sex lives, but can really deeply resonate with some of the stories that we've shared. My journey through sex addiction, taking 4 years off of pornography and masturbation, Bryan's history of getting diagnosed with chlamydia and testicular cancer on the same day. And so this episode is so special because for the first time, we're going to be sharing some of your stories, real life listener stories. And we have two very courageous and gracious men, David and Ricky, as we'll call them, they're not their real names, have consented to sharing their stories of introspection that was catalyzed by their listening of this podcast. You'll hear much more about these guys as we go through the podcast, but just a quick overview. David is a man in his early 40s, married, 2 children, senior vice president, very successful at a large financial services institution. And then Ricky, 40s, early 40s, single man, entrepreneur, high profile, very successful, looking for love, hasn't found it. Both of these men are what you would classify as normal men. Neither of them are sex addicts. Neither of them really thought that they had much of a problem with anything in their sex lives until they listened to some of the discourse that we had around how pornography may be affecting your life, how masturbation, how some of these secretive, isolated behaviors or uninspected patterns and habits and beliefs that you learned from a very early age in your household, through your faith, through your family, through your friends, manifest over the course of time that can cause real barriers to intimacy and sexual potency and power and connection with the person that you choose to bring into your bedroom. So I cannot thank you, David and Ricky, enough for consenting to sharing your stories, because your gifts are going to connect with so many other men and women who are listening to this. And for any of those of you who are inspired by this sharing at the end of this podcast, if you would like to send me and Bryan your stories, you can send me personally your story at dominic@dominicq.com, dominic@dominicq.com, and I'll hold it confidential. In the meantime, enjoy this podcast and let us know what you think.
Dominic, we just got done looking at some of our podcast numbers. Who's listening to what are our most popular episodes? And there are 2 episodes that stand above them all.
Yeah.
The first one is your story about Sex Addicts Anonymous. You've got a lot of people saying, is that me? And holy crap, I didn't know this is what Sex Addicts Anonymous was all about.
Yeah, and I think there's also some people who are just gawkers too, who just wanted to see what was on the other side of this world that's really mysterious and potentially dark, at least in their own perception about it.
That was our first most popular one and continues
by
to
far
be
the most popular. Yeah.
The second most popular one is one of the very first podcasts that we put out there. It was one on drift. Yeah. And maybe give us the 1-minute version of drift.
Yeah, drift is a term that I borrowed from the masterful Napoleon Hill, who's most famous for writing Think and Grow Rich. And the book that he wrote where he termed drift was in another one called Outwitting the Devil. Outwitting the Devil was a byproduct of 25,000 interviews that Napoleon Hill conducted with people who were on their deathbeds at the end of their lives, who felt like they had left chips on the table, who had lived lives of regrets. And he wanted to distill this human experience and find out like why people didn't excel in their life, like why they didn't get what they wanted. And he creates this conversation with the devil, and it's this fictionalized version of the devil, but the devil says, I enter the minds of people and establish the habit of drifting. And when I get a person to drift, I can lead them straight towards the gates of hell. And what drifting is, it's this state of a hypnotic rhythm, and we'll hit more about this later. This hypnotic rhythm where we think we're making conscious decisions in our lives, when in actuality, we're not really even behind the wheel of our own car. We're in the passenger seat or even in the back seat. It's our patterns and our habits that cause us to make decisions. So we wake up the same way every day. We go to bed the same way. We drink from the fire hose all during the day. And then weeks bleed into months, into years. And then we wake up one day and we're like, what the hell happened?
Yeah. What just happened in the last 10 years of my life?
Right.
What was I doing?
What was I doing? And like all these things that I said I wanted to do, I achieved many of those things, but I still feel discontent about that. My love life isn't where I want it to be. I feel like I'm trapped. Those are all triggers for drift.
I'm feeling claustrophobic right now as you're talking about this.
Yeah. And most people do. When I talk to people about drift, their eyes just start to narrow. I could see them looking inward as they're looking at me. And there's almost these oh shit moments that I can feel.
Where in my life am I drifting?
Right on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we looked at the numbers of the podcast, who's listening to what, and then there's been one particular area that both Dominic and I have gotten a lot of personal feedback on, a lot of stories that people have shared with us, and that's related to men's relationships with their dick, particularly when it comes to masturbation, sex, sexual exploits, all the above.
Yeah.
And so we thought we'd combine these two things today and share some of these very real stories we've received from people and how some of this podcast and some of the live events we've done here in New York have changed lives, and some other stories where those lives aren't quite changed yet.
Yeah, that's right. And as we went through the book, Outwitting the Devil, which we recommend for everyone to read, it's the number one most influential book of my life. Napoleon Hill talks about there are these 9 areas of our lives where we have desires. When we're connected to our desires in a healthy way, then life is pretty good. But when we connect to these desires in a negative way, it creates this state of drift, and there could be a lot of destruction either internally or externally in our lives. And the number one thing on that list of 9 are desire for sex. And I know this firsthand, but we also have stories from a few men who have openly and willingly shared with me and have given their consent for us to share on this podcast. It'll blow your mind. These 2 men I know on a number of levels. They are 2 of the most successful men. One of them is a senior vice president in a corporate environment in his early 40s, married with a few kids. And I'll read his story in a minute. And then another man is a single man, also in his early 40s, who would be considered a ladies' man and a guy's guy. So like someone that everyone would look up to, very successful entrepreneurially. And these 2 stories of quote unquote normal men will blow your minds. And because my story of sex addiction triggered their ability to share and look inside and say, holy shit, the areas where I thought I had it right, I don't. It
interrupted the pattern that they had in their life. They interrupted that drift. They interrupted the word that I continuously hear is I just got into a rhythm. Yeah. And it's just what I did. I got into this rhythm. That's where, when you say their eyes narrow and they focus and you start talking about drift, that's where I see them go, oh shit. Crap. And so the stories that Dominic's going to share, they're very specific. They're very real people. And we've heard tons. I mean, I've heard probably 10 to 15 stories that are similar to these.
Yeah.
So we know it's striking a chord. We know it's something that a lot of guys are going through, and it's worth hitting over and over again.
And our intention of having this particular conversation with you today is so that you can make this really personal for you. And my story of sex addiction for most people is too extreme. I was out there on the edge, but there are many parts of the story that can resonate with you. And by sharing these normal men's stories, and I sometimes have an ambivalent relationship with that word normal, because what is normal really, right? And what we perceive as normal when we look behind the scenes is not always the case. But I think that in your world, meaning you, our listener, you would categorize these men as normal. And in some cases, admirable, desirable. Like I would want to live up to their standard, at least from what most people see of them on the outside. We're going to share their stories now. Here's a story of David. David is the married man in his early 40s. He has 2 young children, I believe under the ages of 7 or 8, senior vice president in a major financial services firm, and makes a fair amount of money. So in terms of the standards of which our listeners are typically accustomed to, like this guy is living the life.
Normal and successful.
Yeah. Abnormally successful.
Abnormally successful.
Yeah. Dominic, I must tell you, I speak of you often to others with your work and how impressed I am. Not the financial success, mind you, but the issues you look to tackle and create some badly needed dialogue. It is healthy discourse to better people's lives. So this all leads me to point out that I was dumbstruck by your podcast discussion around sexual addiction. You shared this with me at dinner when you were in town, and if I was dismissive or not as inquisitive in my reaction, please understand this came from a place of ignorance and frankly my concern to respect your privacy. This man and I had a relationship for years and he did not know about my sex addiction. Our podcast had already been released and he had not heard it yet. So that was the first time he'd heard about my history in sex addiction. So this is back to David's story. But when I listened to your detailed description of your addiction and its causes, it was like a bat to the face for me. I too have suffered from all that you shared. The chronic masturbation to ease stress and anxiety started at an early age and continued on into the future. Technology radically escalated in my early 20s and it just got in my 20s and it just got more and more intense. For me, it turned me inward sexually after being in an amazing relationship with a woman in my early 20s. We broke up and I struggled to find sexual happiness for a long time that could equal the pornography. And you and I hear this a lot in the work that we do. Sex with women became simply acting out of what I knew about sex. And over time, porn was all I knew. I forgot all of the intimacy that really made sex great. Another theme we hear. The performance was all that mattered. And the overwhelming strain of putting that into practice of performing only pushed me more into the world of porn. Fast forward into when he was married. After the kids were born and sex became less frequent, another theme that we hear, I was both sad and yet perversely and secretly happy to make porn my sex life. Both perversely and secretly happy to make porn my sex life. So this is sad and happy.
There's a secret going on here.
A secret and also this paradox of emotions inside, right? That like we hear this from a lot of men. It's like, yeah, I'm sad that I'm not connecting with my partner, but at the same time, I'm kind of happy that I now get to dive into this world and my wife is consumed with the kids and so she's not going to ask questions.
I feel the high when I go do my thing. And I don't really have to tell anybody. She's doing her thing.
And I've got air cover because she's now consumed with the kids. And so there's that going on, but there's an inner tension. What an empty and unfulfilling way to live. So your talks shook me and I did something about it. I disconnected all of my porn as of May 1st. And he sent this on May 21st.
And this is, Dominic, just so I understand, this is after he had a conversation with his wife.
So he decided to disconnect from his porn on May 1st, had not told his wife about it yet, right? I went cold turkey.
Clean it up first.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's right.
Then have the conversation. I know that very well.
I believe it's actually quite responsible. He was getting his bearings first before like communicating something that could potentially be really messy. And I think that was a really thoughtful approach. I went cold turkey for 3 weeks on masturbation. Man, that was hard. No pun intended. But what has followed has been a mental clarity that I have not felt in a very long time. I just shared this with my wife, what I was doing this weekend. So after 3 weeks, I see so clearly how it messed with the brain chemistry with surges of dopamine and the extreme visuals of porn, just crushing my brain, leading to a super high, followed by a major crash over and over again. It was an escape from stress and yet followed with a depressing crash every time. And this is where I think that he was like really in tune with himself because most men we talk to would not call that a crash. Most men would ignore it and just kind of go on with their business.
They call it a clean up and then move on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And like he was able to witness it. So I think that's really powerful.
I do wonder if that's something that he did on his own or after listening to that podcast, he said, oh, this doesn't feel quite right. There's a waking up that's going on in him. I feel it in this story.
You know, that's a great point, man. I feel on some level he knew, he could feel it, but couldn't like name it. And because he doesn't talk to anybody about this shit, right? Who does, like most people don't. Then hearing the story, it kind of like provided that mental clarity right away. So, oh, this is what I was feeling. All of this is my way of simply saying, thank you. Your honesty helped to bring me to face what has been at the root of so much pain and disconnection from my wife. You are doing great work, and I have no doubt you are turning on that light for others. And what he's doing is paying that forward by not only sharing the story with me, but giving his consent to share it on this podcast, because now he is providing potential clarity for others who are feeling something similar to his story.
I love amplifying this story because it's such a clear delineation between something that can be a positive force of desire this sexuality, this connection with his wife that he's re-embarking on now, and the negative part of the desire, if left unchecked, if left in this hypnotic rhythm of this is just what I do and why I'm doing it.
Yeah, totally. And for the married guys out there, Bryan and I are not married. We don't have kids. We've never been married, so we don't have that experience. But we do have a lot of clients who are men, who are married in that position, especially with younger children. And the dynamic of that shifting relationship with their wives is real. You heard David here talking this story about he felt sad of the lessening of sex with his wife after kids were born because of maybe not having as much time, being stressed out, but also in many cases, women's brains are chemically altered. And this is based on research from a book called The Female Brain that I've been tearing through. And it's fascinating how women's brains have changed, where women, in some cases, in many cases, from what this book shares, their needs for desire and romanticism and being emotionally met actually can be quite fulfilled through the relationship with their children, especially during the breastfeeding stage. So that desire for closeness and intimacy can happen often with their child. And so it's not as necessary to receive that from their spouse, from their husband. And the husbands still have that desire, that need for connection. And now they're boxed out and they're feeling that. So David, in this case, felt the sadness, but there was also that history he'd built up, his relationship with porn, that he was like, okay, cool. Now I have that air cover. I can go over here and she's not going to ask questions because she's tired and she doesn't want to deal with it.
And I deserve it. I've been doing this forever. There's an element here too
entitlement
that guys love, which is control. And for fair reasons. Because I can do it on my time, however long I want. I can choose the things that turn me on.
Yep.
And we start to forget that with that control comes a certain element of loss in, let's call it, the real world.
Yeah. So say more about that. Like, when you say control, what did you see David trying to control here?
You had mentioned the chemistry of a woman after giving birth.
Yeah.
And there is that connection that we as guys want too in different ways. And when that goes away, even for a period of time, the nature will not allow a void to exist.
Right.
So it has to be
fill that void
with something. And what's really hard for guys is to have a conversation that's very open, very honest, very transparent, and self-aware with their wife or with their partner. And so what's easier to do instead of having that conversation is just go fix the problem. Like, we are fixers.
Yeah, we've talked about this before, man. Guys are good at getting their needs met, but they're not as good asking for what they need. Do you see what I'm saying? There's a difference here. So for example, his need was connection with his wife, sex, and he didn't know how to ask for that in that situation. So he went and just got it through his relationship with porn. And it was a short-term
We can do that through our habits. We can get what we need without even recognizing what we need.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Like all I know, what's built into my neurochemistry, right, is go get the porn. I feel better. Let's move on.
Yeah. I need to get off. I need stress release.
Exactly. I would say in the millions of times that maybe I've masturbated, like I can't remember how many times I sat down and I was like, I need stress relief now. Go. Right? It's more like, I'm going to flip the computer on and just do it.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of thought that goes into it.
No.
And so the conversation with a wife about what are these needs that are not being met, takes a lot of thought. Not just a lot of thought. It takes a lot of
knowing yourself
and feeling and knowing yourself, and then being able to talk and express that. And you know what? As a guy, I'm freaking busy.
Well, yeah, exactly. That's the thing.
Going on.
That's the thing.
So I think I'll go jerk off.
Men that we talk to are often looking at this area of their life, like sex, as the place that they shouldn't have to work. And I totally understand that because you're working in all these other areas. I'm working as a father. I'm working as a businessman. I'm building these things. I'm responding to emails. I'm traveling. I'm working out, whatever. All these things. It's work. And the one area that you just kind of unconsciously assume where you shouldn't have to is in this dynamic in your relationship with sex. And as it turns out, there's work that needs to be involved there too. But when you bring this expectation that these conversations may need to be had, there may be an emotional blowback, there may be weirdness, there may be feelings of vulnerability and pain, and maybe her saying no to some of your desires, to be able to know how to sit in that requires work. And these guys are so stressed out. And then when you take the belief that you shouldn't have to work, the conversations get avoided. And that's how David ends up in a place where he does.
And the question for David then is, Is it worth having the conversation? Is it worth the connection? The question I would ask back to that is, what's your relationship like right now? What kind of relationship do you want?
Yeah. Alison Armstrong, who wrote the book, The Queen's Code, and she's phenomenal. In the book, she says that men are energy resource management hounds. Like, we're constantly asking the question that you just said, which is this worth it? Is this worth it? Is this worth it? Is this worth it? Is this energy plus or is this energy minus? And in a man's mind, it's like, I could go and have the conversation with my wife that may sap me of energy I don't even have yet. Or this idea of going into the bathroom for a little bit and whacking off the porn, that sounds exciting. I'm going to go do that. So that feels like an energy plus in the moment. In the short term, you're right. Mm-hmm. In the long term, that's drift. That's that hypnotic rhythm that leads you down the path of like, where the fuck am I now? I'm disconnected from my wife.
To David's opening part of the story.
Right on.
Right. There is one more element, Dominic, and I know we're going to get into the second story here shortly. There is one more element of being self-aware, a champion, bringing this conversation to the wife, to the woman, and being like, here's what I need, and it all of a sudden magically comes to light. But there's an element, too, that we don't have to have it all figured out. There's an element of vulnerability that needs to be talked about in this moment, because what I feel myself doing right now as we're having this conversation is, okay, I need to know myself. I need to know my triggers. I need to know what I want, and then I can go tell her.
Yeah, so I can get what I want.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other option is to go in, just like, hey, here's what's been going on. Here's what I'm feeling, and work through it together. Co-create the situation together, and that takes a lot of pressure off of us.
Yeah, and her.
And her.
Yeah.
You're doing it together.
Because you're doing it together,
right?
Yeah.
So I think the encouragement here is to certainly have a conversation and not worry about having it all figured out.
Yeah.
But know, just like David did, like what it's doing to him internally.
What I like about what David did was that he spent those 3 weeks interrupting his pattern. So his pattern in the past was isolate, porn, masturbation. And then he said, you know what? I'm going to take a month off of porn. I'm going to take 3 weeks off of masturbation. He did that stuff. And then he felt equipped to have a conversation with his wife because he was like the mental clarity that came. And this is what my coach from the past, John O'Connor, told me, and you're working with him now. I oftentimes don't know why I do the things I do until I stop doing them for a period of time. That's why I'm such a big fan of these temporary abstinence periods, like taking 50 days off of television and Netflix, taking a month off of alcohol, like all that stuff. So he's taking a month off of porn and masturbation, mental clarity. Here's what this was all about. And then he can bring a steady conversation to his wife without having it all figured out. Yeah. Let's move on to the next story. So let's pick a name because I want to keep this guy's...
I always, if there's any Ricks listening to this, I apologize. Whenever I'm telling a story, particularly one like this, I always use the name Rick.
Do you use Rick?
I use Rick every time. I really don't even know a Rick. Maybe that's why I use it.
I've met one Rick in my life.
Okay. Well, Rick that Dominic knows, we apologize, but here's the story from Rick.
Yeah, I feel like Ricky was like a 1950s name. You just don't name kids Ricky anymore. Anyway, so...
Is Rick short for Richard?
Yes.
It could also be Dick.
Which is a big part of our work.
Oh, boy. Yeah, let's move into the story.
Rick?
Rick.
Okay, we're staying with Rick.
This is Rick's story.
So this is Rick's story. Rick is an early 40s, very successful entrepreneur, ladies' man, guy's guy. This is how he would be described by most. And when he heard about my story of sex addiction, he came to me and said, I was so moved by your story. I've come to a point in my life where I'm at a crossroads. The way I've been living doesn't feel right. And so I actually walked him through one of the exercises that I did in Sex Addicts Anonymous to get really clear on the origin story.
When he came to you with this story and he said something's not feeling right,
yeah,
did he go into like detail of what that is or like what's not right?
Yeah, so he was feeling like I've had sexual conquests for the past 2 decades of my life. I do well with women. I also don't do well with women. The women I want end up cheating on me and dumping me. And there's plenty of women that I do sleep with who are quite Instagram worthy, right? I love taking pictures with them and showing off so that I can get validation for, look how attractive this woman is, and therefore she's with me, and look at how attractive I am. He found himself in this place of just these patterns of attracting women, hot and heavy at first, and then it falling apart because either she rejected him, cheated on him, or he would reject her, cheat on her. And what he said he wanted was a meaningful relationship that he could build towards a marriage with kids. And it constantly eluded him.
He was playing the same game over and over and over again, and it would either go up and out where he's getting what he wants and she's not, or down and out where she's getting what he wants and he's not getting what he wants. And he's like, I need something different.
Yeah, I need something different. He doesn't know how to break the pattern. And I think when you hear his origin story, when you go back in time and learn and listen to how he learned from his parents and from other forces, how he ended up in this situation. And as you're listening to Rick's story, I would encourage you to ask some of these questions that I asked him to yourself. And again, this was an exercise that I went through in Sex Addicts Anonymous about the origin story of the forces that shaped your sexuality. And you and I always talk about that the 3 F's of forces that shape your sexuality, your faith or lack thereof, your family, and your friends all teach you what sex is and it isn't in your upbringing and most formative years. So some of this stuff is going to be laying groundwork about Rick's past, and you'll see why it's important in a minute. Rick grew up going to an all-boys private school. He had lots of friends, active and successful in sports. He had a typical middle-class childhood, as he would describe it. My mother has very strong masculine energy, and she definitely wore the pants in the relationship with my father. My mother always fiercely defended her children and did whatever it took to ensure we got a good education, that we were healthy, polite, and did the right thing. And my father worked hard as a veterinarian. I saw him mostly for an hour or two at the end of each day. He coached me in sports, willed me to do well at school, and he did his best. This is interesting. My dad stopped hugging me around the age of 12 when we reverted to handshakes. And my parents have never told me, I love you. I know that they do, but we don't say that in our family. And on the 3 occasions I've either said or written, I love you to my parents, the 3 occasions in his 4-decade life, it was met with silence and awkwardness. I've never been abused physically or sexually. My parents did the best that they could, and I consider their best to be pretty good. Let's pause here for a moment because there's some things that are really important here. So my parents never said that they loved me, and when I did say I loved them, they met me with an awkward silence. This goes to show very early on that intimacy is uncomfortable in that household, a closeness. So there's like an unspoken thing that, yeah, we're all here together and I care about you. There was always a wall up in their family.
Yeah. We get a question a lot from parents. How do I make sure that my son doesn't turn into a Me Too type of guy? Right? It's oftentimes the question.
Yeah.
The answer isn't a training. It isn't a book to read. It's often what's being modeled in the household.
Oh, yeah.
And is intimacy something that they see? And so looking back at the parents' relationship on what is it that they're going to be modeling from. So
right on.
What I'm hearing in this story is there was a modeling, and it was one of a lack of intimacy at the very least.
So this is a perfect jumping off point to the model. So I asked the question, what did you witness in terms of your parents' relationship with one another? I perceived my parents to have a loveless and sexless marriage. My mother always wore the pants in the relationship, and here's where it gets really deep. She would tell my father where to park. She would tell my father to take out the trash. She would boss him around. My dad would sigh and complain, but ultimately give in to her ways. I suspected my mother of having an affair with another person in the town that I kind of knew who he was. I'm leaving out the names here. My parents would finally divorce after 30 years of marriage in the early 2000s. It was my mother's doing. My father was very bitter and upset. I perceived my father to be weak because my mother bossed him around. And because my father was bald, I perceived being bald to be weak. Let's take it a step further.
Didn't see that coming. Okay.
Yeah. So you can make these associations. I watch my father. He's getting bossed around by a powerful woman, and he's bald. Therefore, he's weak, and therefore baldness must equal weakness. Years later, I would become obsessed with my physical appearance, especially my hair loss. I underwent 4 hair restoration surgeries in a bid to keep my perceived good looks. Anything to not feel like the weak man I perceived my father to be. Anything to remain attractive to women. I regret the surgeries. And by the way, these surgeries could be up to tens of thousands of dollars per one. I think he spent over $40,000 on these things. I regret the surgery. I wish I would have simply shaved my head. And because of my father's perceived lack of manliness, I suspect I rebelled against women in general, never wanting to be like that, right? And I decided to learn the art of seduction. I treated women as disposable pleasures rather than meaningful pursuits. So let's pause there. This shows like how deeply rooted what we learn from our parents and what they've modeled to us can profoundly affect the way that we make decisions in life. He was deeply afraid of losing his own hair because he was like, oh my God, my father was bald. He was weak. And therefore, if I'm bald, then I must be weak like him. And women, I can't allow them to see me that way.
We often make decisions from this very scary place. And you and I have talked about this, Dominic, in some of our live events. But when a red flag goes up for me, when I hear things like, I will never be that.
Yeah.
Or never again will that happen. Because some of the decisions that we start to make come from this like either holding on to or pushing away from so drastically, so hard. It leads to $40,000 of hair surgery, which isn't a bad thing, but maybe not for the right reason.
You make those decisions not really even knowing that you're making that decision. We can look back on it in hindsight and say, I made the decision that I will never be like my father. I'll never be weak and I will never have a bald head. But like, it wasn't really like a conscious conversation you had with yourself to say, I will never be like that. It's usually just a feeling of fear and knowing I don't want to be like that. And so all of these decisions start to pop up. One of them being $40,000 worth of hair transplant surgeries. Another one of them being learning the art of seduction because I never want to be a disempowered pussy like my father was. And therefore, I'm going to start to build my life around, instead of having a woman with the upper hand, I'm going to have the upper hand. And what that automatically sets into motion is this dynamic of when you're with a woman, it is no longer about balance and co-creation. It's who has the fucking upper hand. And you'll see this play out over the course of Rick's stories as he starts to share further. So I asked him, what were some of the sexual behaviors that you started implementing? And he goes, my late teens and entire 20s was all about seducing and conquering. So he was probably part of the community who read The Game and The Art of Seduction. And it was basically, if you're not familiar with it, The Game was one of these books written by Neil Strauss about how to be a pickup artist, and went into the world of disempowered men who had been chumps their whole life and never been able to like feel confident talking to women who'd been rejected, who learned these psychologically manipulative techniques to put a woman down so that you could have the upper hand and therefore cause her to chase you. And it's all of these psychological mind fucks. It has nothing to do with
the goal of having sex.
With the goal of getting sex.
Right.
And being in power and being a ladies' man and getting approval from other guys, and very little emphasis, if any emphasis at all, on co-creation and intimacy. Okay, so my late teens and entire 20s was all about seducing and conquering. I seemed to become attractive to women, and so seduction was quite easy for me. I prided myself in racking up huge numbers of sexual conquests, and with very physically attractive women too. By age 25, I'd already slept with more than 100 women. That number had doubled by age 28, and I'm confident I've had sex with more than 300 women in my lifetime. My entire adulthood had been
300?
Spent... Yeah.
The time alone.
Yeah.
For 300. So jokes aside here, because there's plenty to be made, the amount of focus, energy, time, probably dollars that goes into that is astounding.
Yeah, and the emotional energy that goes into that.
All of it.
Now, you and I both had this conversation before we started recording. You and me of 15 years ago would have looked at that and been like, that's awesome.
Oh, 300.
How did you do it?
High fives and hand claps.
Yeah, you're amazing. And also, there would have been a bit...
Teach me.
Yeah, teach me. I would have been envious of that. And I would have also been jealous of that and been like, what the fuck is he doing? How's he getting this? And I've been pissed off about it. And you were the one who said, when I hear this story now, I feel sadness. Because like you could see that he was just stabbing around trying to find this validation that for brief moments of time would come.
Yeah.
But then ultimately...
300 sexual conquests by the age of, 28, 30 years old?
So he said...
Like that.
Yeah, 300 by now. He said he had over 200 by 28. Okay, so over the last decade...
200 by 28. Like, for sure, there wouldn't have been a more manly guy in the room...
than him.
From my perspective, right? Back in the day. And would have brought up things like jealousy. And now, I look at that and I'm like, wow. There's like deep sadness in that. There's like... how much do we have to like continually go after this thing?
Yeah.
And like, when's enough? Is it 301? Is it 302?
Yeah.
Like, oh, it feels exhausting.
Yeah. And that game of seduction is something that he knows, and he knows it well. It's like patterned in his DNA now. And that's why he's found himself in this place of, I want this committed relationship. I want this loving intimacy with someone I could build a future with. But what I really know over 300 conquests, 300 trips to the gym, living this lifestyle on a daily basis, like he's built a very different kind of muscle.
Yeah, I don't know how to do it. If the point was the conquest, the point was the sex, it was kind of like, good, got that, move on. And there's no lesson, there's no growth, there's no evolution in that. And that's the sad part. Because there was, let's just call it 300 opportunities for connection, 300 opportunities to build that new muscle of connection, but that wasn't the point.
And he would tell you that on some level, there were connections with each and every one of them, right? On some level, but you'll get into here and see how shallow those connections were. I became masterful at seducing women, starting a sexual relationship, but never committing to an intimate one. When things started to get intimate or serious, I would sabotage the relationship, citing travel or work or something else, anything that got me out of a deep connection. And he would say, like, I didn't know I was really avoiding the deep connection. It was just like this discomfort, this nebulous, unnamed discomfort that would cause that.
Just to restate, this is an exercise you took him through, right? So this is his reflections on his past, which is a great place to find wisdom.
Yes.
But, right. It's not always in the moment that we're seeing this.
Yeah, right on. That's why doing this inner work is so important. The few girlfriends that I had in relationships lasting more than 3 months, I would cheat on. One woman fell in love with me. We were boyfriend, girlfriend for 1 year and then on again, off again for another. While she wanted an intimate relationship, I would say nice things to her, but then secretly have sex with other women behind her back. There were too many beautiful women in the world that I knew I could have sex with. When in later relationships in my early 30s, I would deliberately act unreliable. I would feel a sense of relief when women would break up with me, thereby preventing me from having to do so. He would deliberately act unreliable and feel a sense of relief that women would break up with him because that allowed him to avoid the responsibility of stepping up as a man and communicating what he truly wanted and delivering a tough message.
Totally.
Right?
I 100% get this. I had a woman that I was dating tell me that she loved me.
Yeah.
I just said, I'm not there yet. And I knew that we really shouldn't have been dating, but I just dragged out that I'm not there yet for a solid 3 or 4 months until she broke up with me.
Yeah. And until the sex was like no longer that interesting for you.
It just crumbled into disgustingness.
Right. That slow, like disappearing, that slow withdrawal.
Yeah. Because it was way easier than being like, hey, here's how I'm actually feeling in this relationship.
Yeah. Because then there could be an emotional reaction, right? And John Wineland, who is my spiritual intimacy and masculinity coach, he constantly says, men's nervous systems have not been trained to adequately handle a woman's emotional response in this world. That could be anything from seeing a beautiful woman walking down the street and like you just lose your breath and imagine the idea of like going up to her and talking to her. Like you could just go silent, like you could be without words. That's one way. Another way is if a woman is in her emotional fury and her storm, especially if it's directed at you, you just want it to go away. You want to shut down, or you'll fight back and you'll raise your voice and you'll scream louder. Learning how to actually like have the conversation, let her have her reaction, and to hold that requires training and skill. And while Rick trained himself on how to be a master of seduction, he did no training whatsoever in being able to have those emotionally uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah. Well, I think that conversation and how to have it and how to navigate it is one part of this. I think a part before that was just the self-awareness. And if I look at my story where why didn't I bring it up to her other than just saying, no, I don't love you yet?
Yeah.
That's really where we left it. Like, why didn't I say more than that? It's because I wasn't aware.
Yeah.
I knew I was in a relationship. I wanted to be in a relationship. She was okay. Maybe I'll grow into it. Maybe I will start to love her at some point in time. So there was like this very like a numbing, a lack of awareness that wouldn't even allow me to have the conversation, even if I was afraid of it.
Did you really think though that maybe you might fall in love with her over time? Did you know in your heart of hearts that like I wasn't going to fall in love with her?
Upon reflection,
100%. 100% what?
I knew that I was not going to fall in love with her for sure.
Yeah, but you wanted to keep having the sex that you were having for as long as you could. So you kind of gave this little...
It wasn't even about the sex, honestly. It was like a legit monogamous relationship.
Okay.
And I knew that I wanted a monogamous relationship.
For now.
And there was some things that were fulfilling in it.
Got it.
And maybe love would grow.
Right. But you just said that you didn't think that love was going to grow. Like you knew.
Upon reflection. In that moment, though, I was kind of like, oh, maybe it actually would.
Oh, okay. So you did think that.
But upon reflection, like, no, what were you doing? Yeah. Like, absolutely not.
But I mean, for me, I've always known in my relationships, I've like always known this thing has like potential or this thing is going to end.
See, I was terrible at that.
You were bad at that?
I was like, that's how out of touch I was with my feelings and emotions. I'm like, what is this like data actually coming up into me? I was just like, oh, there's a feeling? Make that go away.
Yeah.
Like,
I can relate to that part of it.
Love wasn't even a feeling. It was just like something that happened. You know? Like, that's where I was at. So I'm resonating with this. I get it.
Okay, cool. So I asked him this question about what beliefs, we're back to Rick now, what beliefs about sex and your sexuality did you acquire? I created a belief that women were attracted to an alpha male, a man who was strong, who made shit happen, who didn't show emotion, who talked dirty, who took control in the bedroom. Everything his father was not. I read an online book called Sex God Method, which detailed how to be a master in bed. And when I practiced what it taught, grabbing a woman by the throat, taking control, telling her what to do to pleasure me, women seemed to genuinely feel excitement. They would compliment me later saying, "You're such a man. You're so sexual. Your masculinity is such a turn on." And it was all acted, right? This reinforced the opinion that I had to be a strong alpha male, had to be strong physically to look my best, including keeping a full head of hair. And so I ended up having dominant sex. The idea of intimacy or slowing down during sex or making love feels uncomfortable to me. I don't even know what it means.
By the way, a quick thing here. All those things that you just described, that Rick described, women are attracted to that.
Yeah.
They do enjoy a lot of those things. Maybe not all the time.
Right.
But those aren't necessarily bad things.
They're not bad
things. It sounds
things.
like if that's where it stops, that's where the problem starts.
Yeah, and it was also acted. It wasn't from a pure place of intentionality, and he was putting on a facade. It was a performance. It wasn't, right?
Yeah.
It was a performance. And so he's like, oh, this is the standard that I have set now. And now I have to deliver on this every time. There's no room for fucking up. There's no room for something slower. There's no room for being tired or letting your dick go soft because he had to be this alpha dominant, perfect man every single time.
Not bald, always hard.
Yeah.
Biceps up.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. And so he created this condition of expectation too. The idea of intimacy or slowing down during sex or making love feels uncomfortable to me. I don't even know what that means. I believed I had to be financially successful in order to attract the best women. How many guys can relate to that? Yeah. Because that's what women are attracted to, I told myself. However, for most of my adult life and until recently, I rarely earned more than $100,000 a year. Now, that was really surprising to me when I'd heard that because based on the image he projects, you would expect millions of dollars a year. And I think
he's really good at performance.
Very good at performance. And he may be at that place now, but like I would have believed that that was kind of his lifestyle for a long time. This was something I always kept to myself. It was easier to have women think I was financially better off than I actually was. And when you do that, is there any opportunity for real intimacy to form? Because like at certain stage, she's going to see behind the curtain and that's a fearful place for him. And so he probably is going to shut down before she can get that close.
Completely feel that.
What patterns have you repeated and where did you learn that behavior? The same patterns continue. I meet attractive women. I have not very good sex with them. I lose interest or run at the first signs of intimacy. Besides only a handful of women, I lose sexual interest in my partners after having sex with them the first or second time. You can relate to this. You said in stories that the best sex I used to have was the first time. That's and right. The second best sex was the second time. And then it would just gradually decline.
Progressively worse.
Yeah. I have taken Viagra and Cialis to combat my lack of sexual desire for them. And this goes into like actually this pattern starts to escalate and create problems for him in the future about like getting it up. These days, I have very low libido. I don't even know if it's because of years spent taking the hair loss drug Propecia, studies show can lower libido, or the fact that I am aging. I am now in my early 40s, but I feel indifferent to sex. I often take Cialis or Viagra in order to get an erection. It's as if the testosterone-fueled days of my 20s and 30s have disappeared, and I have the sex drive of an 80-year-old man. I no longer seduce and conquest, although I'm sure I could if I want to. Instead, I walk around in a low libido state, avoiding sexual contact with my on-again, off-again partner because I'm such a poor lover. And what he means by a poor lover is like he's comparing himself to the dominant alpha man who is taking control in bed, being hard all the time. He sees himself as the opposite now. not as interested in sex, not as dominant, not as hard, and therefore that means poor in his mind. When single, I merely observe attractive women who walk by me in the street. I rarely, if ever, approach these days. And yet, I seem to long for a long-term partner and children. I want to have children. I seemingly had poor role models in my parents. I have a natural aversion to the idea of marriage as a result of it. So after Rick had shared these written responses with me that I just read to you, we sat down for lunch. And one of the things that became really clear for me was that because of the dynamic that he witnessed with his parents at an early age, his mother wore the pants, she bossed him around, his father was resentful of that, but he ultimately acquiesced to it. Rick viewed dynamics between men and women as a power play. There was always someone who had the upper hand. And with women that he had in his life where he was seducing, he would see them as targets above him before she felt an interest to him. And he wanted to be the one with the upper hand. And so there would always be this game of, she's hot, I'm going to seduce her. Naturally, she loses her grip as being the one on the pedestal. And then they would hook up, they would sleep together. And here's where the dynamic would then become this like fucked up game of me versus you. He would either maintain that upper hand. And so she would be needy and wanty and wanted to spend more time with him. And then he would be somewhat repulsed by that, repulsed by the fact that she was so needy. And then he would cheat on her and then allow that thing to slip away. Or he would end up inside of that relationship dynamic where the woman would then still maintain the upper hand for whatever reason. He would become needy, just like his father, and he would become weak. And then she would boss him around, and then she would cheat on him because that's not very attractive when a man is needy. It's one of the least attractive things a man can be, is just needy. And so it was just constantly, all of his relationships were with a wall up, not recognizing that he was doing this, not recognizing that everything was a power play, versus looking at a woman as a potential partner in crime, like someone that you could co-create with, someone that you could actually expose all of your flaws and insecurities to, and have those met and have those embraced by that person, while also sharing amazing and diverse moments of sexuality, dominant sex, submissive sex, intimate sex, quickies, long like tantra sessions, whatever, and everything in between. And for him, unconsciously, he had drifted into this place of, I have to be the alpha dog. I have to be the one with the upper hand. I have to be masculine. These are the expectations. And if I'm not this guy, then she's not going to want me.
When you were talking about some of the patterns that he was recognizing, and including that one of either cheating or being cheated on, what I'm getting a sense of is he's tried the Viagras and the Cialises. He's tried to kind of get that back because that's what he knows.
Artificially, he's trying to get it back. Yeah.
Right. It feels like he's in identity crisis mode.
Yeah.
Like my identity was this sexual prowess, never being my dad sort of guy.
Yeah.
And now he's in this place of like, well, why am I not feeling it anymore?
Yeah.
Like, who am I?
Yeah.
Dominic, it's amazing what our bodies do when we're out of alignment.
Yes.
Out of like what our bodies and what we actually want and what we think we want, what we think we want to go attain. And I feel that in the story, like right now, I don't know if that's where the story ends. I'm hoping there's a happy ending, or will be a happy ending, and whatever that looks like for Rick. But man, I feel his exhaustion, his like not even wanting to like go up to a woman on a street to say hello, because God forbid if he performs poorly and says something less than vulnerable.
Totally, man. I can totally relate to that as well. And when he talks about this state of low libido, we now know, you and I now know, that it could be from a variety of different things. You said being out of alignment, right? What the social narrative that you'll see on television commercials is that you just don't have testosterone anymore.
You're getting older, and
yeah.
Right, totally.
Yeah, there's certain validity to that, but it's presented as the complete story.
I don't think you read about this other stuff in the Sex God book.
Yeah, right.
Probably not a lot of vulnerability or getting in touch with oneself in the Sex God book.
And I think that's where a lot of men get their counsel. It's like, I feel disempowered. I feel like I don't have the game that I want. I feel like women have the upper hand on me. And so we start to learn from a place of feeling inferior or insecure. And what we're looking for unconsciously is this place of, I want the upper hand. And then we end up in this place of an upper hand, but then we've created this unconscious dynamic, this power dynamic, this power play. And what we're talking about here, going back to Rick's story about this low libido, I believe a big part of that low libido may have something to do with the physiological testosterone component. It could be that. I also believe it's this inner exhaustion, this energetic exhaustion of playing a game that he's constantly lost at. And each one of these losses over time has caused him to be more and more jaded and feeling more and more hopeless around being able to have that thing he thinks he wants, which is maybe a marriage, and definitely to be a father. He's very clear on that. And I can relate to that quite a bit, dude, because a big part of why we're actually talking about this sex stuff is because like a year ago, I was going through some changes, and still on some level, I'm going through some changes where my desire and drive and libido and dick strength and sensitivity like definitely took a turn. The biggest part of it for me is not physiological in nature. The biggest part of it for me was like, I am craving a very different level of connection and intimacy. And when I have intimacy, I can go forever. And I am sensitive as fuck. And it is amazing and like euphoric to levels that I can't even describe as human.
It's a new type of energy. You know, in our teens, in our 20s, and maybe in our 30s, there's just like this raw sort of energy. And if you got to pop a pill to make that happen, or drink a coffee, or pound a Red Bull, or whatever, like it's there. That, I don't know what you call it, this almost like nervous energy.
Yes.
And the energy that you're describing is so hard to put into words.
Yeah.
But it's this grounded inner energy that feels like there's no ended. There's no need for another Red Bull. There's no need for another pill.
That's right.
It's just there.
That's right. And also this pressure to perform, right? To be that alpha guy, to always be the one who's like standing at attention, and that has left, not entirely. Like there's always residue there, and there's always new parts of myself that I discover as having insecurities and feeling embarrassed to admit certain things in the bedroom. But the big weight that you hear Rick describe, that's gone. That is gone. And I've had a few instances over this last year where things have gone south in the bedroom, where I've actually been able to use those moments as like amazing moments of connection and like opening myself up in a place that woman now had a chance to like meet me there. And so we shared these stories with you with the intention of showing you how many men are out there in different shapes and forms that you look at as ideal, as you look at as living lives that you want to live, or even just friends that are in your circles that you may call buddies who seemingly have all their shit together. And behind closed doors, there are these questions that they're asking themselves too.
In either story, whether it's married guy, masturbation, doing his thing, single guy having to perform and doing the same things over and over and over and over and over again, it's this same word that it comes back to. It's like just this rhythm that we get into, this hypnotic rhythm. It's this drift that we get into. And what's great about both of these stories is it sounds like there has been this interruption. There has been this waking up to what their patterns were. The main thing for me in doing all of this work that you and I do together is simply that. Is can we take a look backwards? Can we see the patterns? Can we wake up to something that's new? And we just talked about this energy that's either frantic energy, like something we constantly need, or this grounded, powerful energy. And knowing what's on the other side of that through these stories is such a beautiful gift.
Yeah, it is, man. That's the work that we do. And in my book, Design Your Future, I write about the big problem as drifting, which is where we started the conversation. And the 3 steps out of drift, it's the first step is the most important. It's the awakening. You cannot change what you're not aware of. And this whole practice that I had Rick go through is one big awakening exercise to be like, holy shit, I can connect these dots about what I learned at home to all of my behaviors 4 decades later here as an adult. And it's just me playing that out. So in order for anything to change, you need to be aware. You need to do that inner work. And the next 2 steps are really around disrupting those patterns. And you heard about that with the married guy who disrupted his pattern of masturbation and pornography for a month, created this amazing mental clarity and awareness. And that last step is really about designing, right? So it's awakening, disrupting, and designing what the new behaviors are, what the new ways of being are. So for Rick, a new way of designing that future is looking for a partner. And when you open up that relationship with that partner, how does he open up his heart earlier on? How does he let her know how he's had sex in the past and how he wants to do it differently here, while also asking her what she wants? Like that is a new and conscious way. And it's going to be rough at times.
And
it's going to be messy at times. Yeah. And can you hang in just a few minutes longer than you did the last time, and you, through constant incremental exposure to what you're uncomfortable from or uncomfortable with, you build your capacity to hang in there.
Yeah. 3 steps in disrupting drift. So it's awareness, it's
awakening, disrupting, and designing.
Awake, disrupt, design. Cool. Design, right? That's a big one. It's like, what do I want it to be and what do I want to create? And I'll say that even after that design, like you and I have done some significant work on morning routines and designing what we want and getting ourselves into those good habits. And I shared with you earlier today, like there are times in my life where I feel like there's friction going on. I feel like I'm not moving as fast as I want to. Things aren't happening. And I look back at some of these patterns in my life. We talked about sexuality being one of them, food being another one, sleeping. And so usually when I look back on even the last, let's say weeks or months, and I find those periods in my life where I'm not quite doing what I want to be doing, I look at those things for me. Masturbating, porn. Food, particularly for me, desserts. Love them cookies.
Yep.
And then what am I sleeping? When am I going to bed? Those 3 things. If I look at those 3 things,
when those are off,
all out of alignment. It's never just one. Yeah. It's usually all 3 of them.
Yeah, you can kind of get away with one of them. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, all right, I can go to bed late a few nights or whatever, but if I'm off the cookies, I'm off, if I'm not whacking off the porn a lot. But it's like those 3 things. When you're eating dessert, it's like you're searching for like a state shifter. You know what I mean? I want to feel that rush of whatever. And then the masturbation and porn is kind of similar, but I also want to escape. And the staying up late, you're avoiding something. You know what I mean? Because like you don't want to, whatever. And all 3 of those things are happening at the same time. It's a pretty big clue. You were doing that all the time for decades.
Right.
And you had no idea that those were like 3 trigger points for you. But now that you're aware of them, I still fall off track. I catch it much more.
I will still drift into it.
Yes.
And the tool that I use now to recognize it, because typically I don't recognize it on day 1.
Right.
But I've gotten better because before it took decades.
Yeah.
And now it takes days.
Yeah. Right. That's quite an improvement.
And so we've talked about this before. I journal in the morning. I start off with a check-in, and I check in, what do I feel physically? What do I feel emotionally?
Yeah.
And when I'm having some of those more, let's say, low vibe or negative emotions, I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And I start journaling, and then I go look back at those 3 indicators: masturbation, porn, desserts, and sleeping. And I'm like, I've been not doing great the last couple of days. Let's disrupt this.
Do you think that like there's an afterlife where you get to do all of those things and there's no consequences?
God, I hope not. I really actually hope not.
You hope not? You hope it's more than that?
I want to give, I hope it's way more than that. 'Cause it's more than that. Oh, God. Unless there's like rainbow cookies involved. I love rainbow cookies, the sugar cookies. But no, I'm hoping there's something else. Yeah.
I'd like to make one final point here for our women listeners, because we have, it seems, just as many women listeners as we do men. As you're listening to these stories and you think about the men in your life, let's just say the romantic relationships you have in your life, there may be this desire to take something like this that you've just heard and then like immediately bring it to the man in your life. And in doing that, without really thinking about setting a proper safe stage for this conversation to be happening, you could have the adverse effect of that. So for example, I had a woman reach out to me who talked about, after she listened to the pornography podcast, she was like, oh my God, I'm blown away by how many men watch porn. And so I brought it to my husband and I was like, how much porn do you watch? Bang. The guy's on the defensive right away. Now he feels like he has to defend himself, and he fucking hates me now for doing this podcast on pornography.
Dominic guy's giving away all the secrets.
All the secret, right?
He's the worst.
Okay, so one of the big things that you and I talk about, especially like to audiences of women, how can you become the safest person for your partner to talk to? Because if you become the safest person, then he will open up to you. Some of this stuff may be triggering for you, understandably so. But by bringing yourself in a triggered state to your partner, it's going to put his sword and shield up, and he's going to be on the defensive, and you're going to have the adverse effect. So let a little time to settle. And if you have the desire to speak to your partner about this, then do so from a place of you feeling calm, compassionate, and curious. I think that's like those 3 things, like calm, compassionate, and curious, where you can welcome someone else in to really open up. Be there from a place of listening for the benefit of the doubt. Hey, thanks for listening to the Man Amongst Men podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you want more access to tools and resources, and you want information on our upcoming live events and retreats, head on over to www.doinnerwork.com.